Hi, I'm Berny Belvedere for the UnPopulist, and this is Zooming In. Today, I'm joined by John Cassidy, longtime columnist at The New Yorker, who for decades has been writing incisively about the state of the economy. John is the author of several well-received books. His first examined the dot-com bubble, and his second, the causes of the Great Recession. But our conversation today centers on his third and most recent, Capitalism and Its Critics, A History, from the Industrial Revolution to AI. As its title suggests, the book is a dive into the history of capitalism through the eyes of its greatest critics. The genesis of Capitalism and Its Critics, John explains, was in 2016, when both the major parties witnessed the rise of candidates for the presidential nomination who were critics of capitalism rather than its champions. On the left, Bernie Sanders, a socialist, harnessed widespread economic discontent into a formidable political operation that nearly denied Hillary Clinton a nomination everyone thought she would easily secure. But the more surprising development was on the right, with the rise of Donald Trump in the party that considered itself an opponent of socialism and a champion of markets. Yet his economic populism, an admixture of neo-mercantilism, protectionism, and nativism, repudiated the Republican commitment to free enterprise. John's analytical starting point, the remarkable fact that in 2016, two of the three people with the best chance at winning the presidency had significant qualms about market liberalism, thus set up a really fascinating perspective. One that is equal parts about the incredible resilience of capitalism and also the stubborn persistence of some of its greatest critics. John is not a market liberal, and there might certainly be things to quibble with in his critique of free market economics, or neoliberalism as he would call it. But his work offers an exceedingly useful look at the political crises and the disruptive technologies that caused both sides to converge on a critique of capitalism and propelled a populist movement that is rocking the core of our liberal democracy. Together, John and I explore why the right turned toward economic nationalism and what his dive into the history of capitalism can tell us about where things might go from here. We hope you enjoy.
In my journalistically formative years, before I officially joined the discourse, your columns were among the sources I'd rely on to get clear on what was happening in the economy. So this was around the time when iPads first came out. I would queue up your articles and chase down every term or concept I wanted to know better. And I gained a lot from your weekly work at The New Yorker. But I think we would need much more than a single podcast episode to wade through your thinking across the years from your columns. So I want to focus on your recent book instead. It's called Capitalism and Its Critics, A History from the Industrial Revolution to AI. And it's fantastic. Your framing choice, which was to run through the modern history of capitalism by foregrounding the challenges put forth by critics, all by itself makes it a must read. But of course, it's also an excellent history in its own right. I've actually found this through the lens of its critics frame to be a really helpful one, not just to understand the critics or their alternative proposals, like some of these A People's History of kinds of formulations try to do, but to better understand the ideas that the critics found wanting. I'll plug another Zooming In episode that I've done. Last year, I talked to Georgetown's Jerome Kopolsky. He had written a book called American Heretics, Religious Adversaries of Liberal Order. And his idea was to profile religious thinkers who are critics, not advocates of American liberal democracy. What made you interested in bringing in the complaints made by, quote unquote, capitalism's heretics, as it were, into your history? Why did the book take the shape that it did? How did the book project come about?
Well, good question, and thanks very much for inviting me on. I would say it came from two things. In the short term, it came from the sort of political situation in 2016 when I first had the idea for the book, when Bernie Sanders was running from the left and Donald Trump was running from the right, both of them offering critiques of capitalism. People have forgotten now that Trump was actually very critical of the sort of structure of the U.S. economy. And he attacked big banks, he attacked big corporations for shipping jobs overseas. And Berny, of course, was providing the sort of left-wing critique. So this seemed to me to be something pretty new in American history, to have major presidential candidates running on critiques of capitalism. And my basic idea was there must be a book here somewhere. That was the sort of short-term thing. The long-term thing is I've always been interested in the history of ideas and economic ideas. My two previous books covered that subject as well. So I started thinking maybe there's a way to frame this sort of crisis of legitimacy of capitalism, which is how I interpreted the situation in 2016, in terms of sort of historical critiques of the system. First thought, maybe I'll just go up to the end of the Cold War and talk about critiques since then. But then I thought, well, that's just going to be another history of neoliberalism. There have been lots of those. And I kept moving further back. I thought maybe I'll start after the Second World War, but then you have to explain where Keynesianism came from. Eventually, I just sort of wrote a backwards recursion process. I thought, well, why not just do it from the start? And where is the start? I mean, I grew up in Northern England. That's where industrial capitalism had its birth, in the rise of the factory system, the rise of cotton mills. So that's where I started the book. It was a very ambitious project because it was basically, here's a history of the last 250 years, but doing it through the eyes of a sort of discrete number of critics, and some of them well-known, some of them not so well-known, gave me a framework. So even though it's a pretty long book, I think it's sort of, hopefully it hangs together as a single narrative and, it's not sort of overwhelming.
You chronicle various crisis points that capitalism faced. And based on your immersion into the history of capitalism, do you find that these crisis points, these sagas in which the capitalist system faced a challenge that would often significantly impact the way it functioned and operated in society, have a lot in common with each other? For example, did capitalism's various crises exhibit similar dynamics?
My thesis is they did. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, to use the old cliche. I'll give a few examples of that. The idea of technological displacement, which is obviously a huge story now because of the AI revolution, that is a theme which runs through the capitalism from the very beginning, with a resistance to steam power and water power in Northern England, which gave rise to the Luddite movement. Then further on in the century, rise of big factory capitalism gave rise to labor unions, etc. So that's one running theme. Another running theme is financial crises. Whatever the underlying dynamics of capitalism are, it's always given a rise to sort of crises every 20 years or so. If you go back to the 1850s, I start my book with Marx and Engels, two of the most famous critics of capitalism, sort of celebrating the 1857 financial crisis, which started in New York and then spread across the Atlantic. They were hopeful for a while that this might be, the sort of final crisis of the system. The crisis of 1857 wasn't the same as the crisis of 2008. The Luddite movement isn't the same as the resistance to AI, but you can't look at both of those things and say there are not commonalities. There obviously are.
I want to come back to AI in just a second, but I want to stay here on this point of historical continuities and discontinuities just for a moment. In an earlier phase of my career, I spent many years as a philosophy lecturer at various colleges and universities. That was my main area of focus. But I also spent a couple of years as a U.S. history instructor at the high school level. And I taught AP U.S. history, U.S. government and politics, macroeconomics for a few years. Looking back, one of the most important analytical tools that I had the most success with as a teacher, pedagogically, was to get as clear as possible on what happened in the past through historical comparison and contrast. And of course, I'm not describing anything esoteric here. This is just a basic requirement of what historians do. It simply involves taking enough of a dive into the past to account for all the ways that one era is similar to, but also, and this is a crucial part, different from another era. One of my takes is that, and I don't think this is particularly controversial, is that a lot of our misunderstandings, our distortions about the past are the product of failing to sufficiently account for differences across historical eras. I've heard historians lament that the biggest problem is that people, by and large, are ignorant of the past. And of course, that's a perennial problem. But they have in mind a kind of ignorance in the more traditional sense, like someone simply not knowing about some past event. The problem I'm referring to involves people knowing something or other about a particular historical episode, but not knowing enough about how the world of that historical moment is different from the world of today. So I just want to give you an example to cue up a question for you. So someone will take what they know about working class jobs today, especially in the service economy. And they'll conceptually transfer that onto past eras and mistakenly conclude certain things about, say, a past era's level of workplace safety, the physical toll that a job would take on a laborer, and many other aspects regarding how jobs were regulated or unregulated, as it were.
Right.
In your dive into this history, what's something that you notice people persistently misunderstand about capitalism's past that then kind of distorts the picture they form about how our system ought to be configured today?
That's a very good question. I think the point you make about historical specificity, which is how I'd put it, is a very, it's a very good one. I've already mentioned Marx, but he has a famous quote from when he was writing about the 1848 revolution in France and the rise of Louis Napoleon. He said men make their own history, but they make it in circumstances which are bequeathed to them. Somebody may say, well, based on the 2008 crisis, the real problem is always in the credit markets. So now you're seeing an example of that. People looking at private credit and saying that's where the next financial crisis is going to come from, because it looks very similar to subprime, which obviously blew up for the 2008 crisis. Now, that may well be true, but if you focus just on that, you're likely to ignore other dangers in the financial system. For example, the sort of rise of stable coins, some of them regulated, some of them unregulated. If there's a crisis in the unregulated stable coins, could that lead to a crisis in the regulated ones, which, because they're backed by US bonds, would lead to a crisis in the bond market? We just don't know. You have to, even if you've got these big ideas, the big idea would be unregulated financial markets are dangerous, which I think is true. You then need to apply that very specifically. I try to do that going through the book. I'm not saying if you study each of these 28 critics, you'll be able to predict the future. I don't think that's true at all. I think if you study the critiques of the past, it gives you a general framework which you can then apply to current and future events. But, I started off as an economic historian, looking very closely at specific data and specific incidents, etc. I got interested in the history of ideas later on. But you have to start with the historical circumstances and the specifics of each situation. Then you can draw on past thinkers. If you're thinking about financial markets, I mentioned Keynes. I have a chapter on Keynes. I think, his theories of how financial markets work, the theory of the beauty contests, sort of a lot of the ideas which underpin behavioral economics these days, they're very useful. But you have to apply them in the specific circumstances. But I think you're exactly right. I mean, I think history is essential, but you've got to be careful how you apply it. Another example I would say would be the huge debate that's going on now about, is Trumpism or Trumpian economic nationalism, can that be compared to fascism in the 1930s? And the obvious answer is, well, it can in some respects and it can't in others. I have a chapter on Karl Polanyi, who lived through 1930s fascism, and I write at length about his theories of socialism and fascism. I think they are very useful, and you'll see some historical parallels if you read them. But you obviously have to be careful to apply them to the modern era, which is different.
Something your book does quite well is convey the remarkable adaptability of capitalism. And obviously you couldn't write a book about a theory that has spanned centuries and continues to shape our world today unless the theory in question were in some sense really important and a successful theory. We don't have lots of books written about the 18th century theory of phlogiston since it was discredited and discarded. But capitalism has found a way to persist even in the face of all the challenges you profile in the book. I'm going to nerd out here for a second. So the philosopher W.V.O. Quine once made the point that our theories, especially our major ones, can always be protected against disconfirmation by finding something else in our cognitive maps that the criticism ultimately takes down. In a sense, something else becomes the intellectual scapegoat. And he said, any statement can be held true come what may if we make drastic enough adjustments elsewhere in the system. I want to ask you a question about this point. When faced with serious challenges to a particular iteration of capitalism, what adjustments to other parts of our social or political architecture or system have proponents offered to make instead so that they can leave untouched capitalism, the version that they favored?
I'd answer that question in two ways. First of all, as you said, the one reason for capitalism great success is its adaptability. The basic mechanism of using the profit motive and markets, people who make a profit get rewarded, people who don't make a profit go out of business. That's proved a remarkably robust model for producing innovation and rising GDP growth. We can argue about how that GDP growth has been distributed, etc. I only have two charts in the entire book. One of them is the sort of hockey stick of GDP growth throughout history. You see it going basically along the ground. The flat part of the stick for sort of thousands of years until 1800, when you have the Industrial Revolution and the rise of industrial capitalism. And then it starts to pick up. And from there, it basically goes vertical. So that is the strength of capitalism. And it survived. That's the reason it survived 250 years. Now, that's not to say it's survived in the same form. We don't want to get into the sort of huge debates about how you define it. As I say, my definition is very simple, one sort of mass production based on the profit motive. But within that framework, there have been all sorts of different forms of capitalism. And that's because you have to bring politics in. The sort of right-wing thinkers and the classical liberals, in some sense, saw the government and market capitalism as antithetical. But if you look at history, that isn't actually what's happened. Government has fashioned various forms of capitalism over the last 250 years and has always stepped in a crisis, the most recent one being in 2008, to prop up the system, similarly in the 1930s. So I see the sort of a relationship between the sort of market economy, capitalist economy, and the government as a sort of symbiotic one, which evolves through the years into various forms in a sort of long-term cyclical pattern. You get a rise of government regulation, then there's a reaction against that, and things move on from there. What Polanyi called the double movement. You have the attempt to create some sort of a free market, and that creates a counter-reaction in the political sphere, which he called the double movement. Those two things together, I think, explain the durability of capitalism. There have been various forms of the system, starting off with the sort of free market, small business capitalism of early 19th century Britain, then evolving into the bigger sort of corporate capitalism of the late 19th century, early 20th century, a more globalized system too, the imperialist era. And then we had the cataclysm of the First World War and the interwar period, and that gave rise to post-war, what I call managed capitalism, other people call Keynesian social democracy, which is still capitalism. Most of the economy was still in private hands, but it was a very different form to 19th century capitalism. And that lasted until about 1980, when Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were elected in the UK and the US. That was a political counter-revolution. Simultaneously, really, in historical terms, the Soviet Union collapsed, so the sort of state socialist model disappeared as an option. China and Russia decided to join the global capitalist economy. We then had this incredible 30 years experiment in sort of neoliberal global capitalism, hyper-globalization, I call it, which, as Polanyi would have predicted, produced a big political reaction against it. There was a financial crisis, and then, the rise of right-wing populist movement and also a left-wing populist movement, which undermined the sort of centrist parties, which had, governed for decades. That's where we are now. The question is, what replaces that? We're in this sort of interregnum period where you've got Trump offering one vision of the future, a sort of nationalist, protectionist, anti-immigration future. And you've got China offering this sort of state capitalism option, which it's a form of capitalism with sort of capitalism without democracy, basically, or with one-party democracy. And then the sort of left and center left are trying to come up with their version, managed capitalism for the 21st century. But they're all varieties of capitalism. Even the most extreme left-wing critics I read about in my book, the sort of degrowth movement, they don't seem to be much support for going back to a sort of planned centralized economy, which is what socialism was understood as in the 20th century. It's much more a sort of return to cooperative, self-governing communities, etc., which actually goes back to some of the people I write about in the early 19th century, when that socialism then was seen as anti-government, really, self-governing communities, small-scale production, So that seems to be the vision which animates young people, especially on the left, more than sort of resurrecting a Gosplan or whatever. So that's where we are. There are these various, we're in this, as I said, interregnum, a sort of political crisis, really.
I want to pick up on that point. I want to quote something from your book that dovetails with what you just said, and then ask you something very specific about that quote and that idea. So here's the passage. Toward the end of the book, you write, "The managed capitalism of the post-war era was based on a hegemonic bloc consisting of manual workers, educated liberals, domestically focused businesses, long-term capital, the continued exclusion of many parts of the world, and Keynesian social democratic policy ideas. The globalized hyper-capitalism that followed the end of the Cold War was based on a bloc consisting of educated workers, internationally minded businesses, short-term capital, the entry of previously excluded parts of the world, and free market policy ideas. The question going into the second quarter of the 21st century was what sort of historical bloc, if any, could exercise power in a world shrunken by digital technology, but also increasingly splintered. I want to ask you, why has digital technology, which at the very core of it, the spirit of it is supposed to be a kind of connecting force by design, why has that increasingly splintered us, as you put it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very deep sort of technological question, I think. My first book, which I wrote in 2002, was a history of the sort of dot-com bubble. And as part of that, I lived through it, I reported on it. If you remember the late 1990s, there was a lot of great optimism about the internet, that, as you said, it break down existing authority. If you think of the original people around Wired magazine, for example, and, the sort of techno-optimists in San Francisco and other places, they saw it as a sort of leveling technology, which would break down existing barriers between people, etc., and as a sort of democratizing instrument. And what we found is it's the opposite. It's very atomizing. People live online by themselves, etc. Obviously, we've seen that. There's a big debate about it, but I don't think there can be any denying that it's led to some sort of social pathologies among younger people who spend long periods online. But more than that, also, I think in economic terms, it turns out that because of the way the internet works, because of diminishing marginal costs or zero marginal costs, the economic structure of the online economy is innately monopolistic, and it's given rise to these enormous tech monopolies or oligopolies, which exercise an enormous amount of power, and in recent years have started to exercise more political power by using their money to basically buy parts of the political system. So I think that, that sort of development, I think most of the people, I never heard anybody in the 1990s say that was going to be the outcome. There may have been some people on the far left who saw it, but I can't remember any particular book or I would have quoted it. So I think that's been a great sort of paradox the last 30 years, that this technology that was seen as a liberating influence or was promoted by, developers and their enthusiasts as a sort of agent of human liberation, as in many ways turned out to be the opposite.
Let's go from the sort of general to the specific on the question of technology. So AI is in the subtitle. How and to what extent is capitalism's ongoing place in society impacted by the advent of AI, in your view?
Well, I mean, that's, I don't have a one-sentence answer to that. I wrote about it in my book. It's one of the two big subjects I've been writing about for the last couple of years, basically Trumpian economics and AI. They are the two huge subjects of our day. And again, it's a bit like the 1990s. There are sort of the optimistic view and the pessimistic view. I tend to, being a journalist, I tend to take this, be the sort of skeptic and more pessimistic. But I think, you have to acknowledge the sort of optimistic view here, that lots of economists just see AI as just the latest transformative technology, which eventually they accept there will be transition costs in terms of labor displacement, etc. They say eventually it's going to produce a huge leap in labor productivity, which, if you look at history, should eventually lead to a rise in wages and rising living standards. That's the optimistic view. I would say 5 years ago, even most orthodox economists subscribe to that view. What we've seen in the last few years, I think, is a darker version of the future coming into view, in which, rather than sort of complementing labor and making labor more productive, perhaps these systems are just going to displace it en masse, particularly cognitive workers, people like us, because if these systems really can do white-collar work more efficiently and obviously much more cheaply than human beings, there'll be profit motives to displace huge chunks of the labor force. So you get people like Dario Amodei, the head of the co-founder of Anthropic, saying that there's going to be 20% GDP growth, but at the same time, half of all white-collar occupations are going to disappear in a very short period. So they're the two polar views. Beyond that, saying the other aspect, which is very worrying, is we've had a huge rise in inequality in the sort of age of hyperglobalization. You can see AI accentuating that even further, because where does all the wealth go that the workers used to earn? Well, it will go to, in that scenario, it will go to the owners of the AI technology, which, if you aggregate that up, it's basically another shift in the distribution of income towards capital. And to be fair to some of the technologists, some of the AI barons, they've acknowledged this. Amodei being one of them is talking about, we're going to have to tax capital income much more, maybe provide universal business incomes to redistribute some of the wealth. So that's, I think, where the debate is now in terms of AI. I would say, 5 years ago, as I said, the consensus among orthodox economists was optimistic, and now it's sort of, well, we're not quite sure what's going to happen. The last piece I wrote on this subject was about sort of strictly orthodox economists starting to acknowledge that questions of distribution were going to be central. One of the economists I wrote about suggests we set up a sovereign wealth fund to invest in these companies and provide sort of dividends to people. Other people think that just taxing the capital and, as I say, providing universal business income. There are various ideas out there, but I think that's where the political debate is going to go in the next decade or so. And I think it's going to cross party lines, because you're already seeing some Republicans, critical of big tech and sort of worried about AI too.
Yeah. And I remember talking to a lot of people, and the first time they really started to think about these issues a little bit more, funny enough, was when Andrew Yang kind of foregrounded this idea, where he's talking about the increase of automation is going to need for us to seriously contemplate something like a UBI. We need people to have purchasing power. We need the economy to not be so misallocated. And so that may be something we have to turn to if AI gets to the point where some people are thinking it might, right? So that'll be interesting, the political impacts of that.
Yeah, you raise a very good point there, which I should have mentioned. The idea of purchasing power. I mean, that goes back to the late 19th century, when the rise of the sort of robber barons, big industries, big iron, big steel, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, JP Morgan, big finance, etc. In the late 19th century, the wealth was piling up. That's what Gilded Age. And some economists did then the idea of sort of underconsumption. Who would be the consumers if the workers can't afford it? That idea eventually gave rise to Keynesian economics. But in the late 19th century, it was associated with a British thinker I write about, John Hobson, who wrote about imperialism, and underconsumption was the idea then. So these ideas go back a long time. Now, what were the solutions? Why didn't it bring down capitalism? One of the solutions was the sort of rise of organized labor and the sort of Henry Ford view of the world. You had to pay the workers because who was going to buy his cars if they didn't, which eventually led to the Treaty of Detroit, in which the great auto companies in the US basically agreed to share productivity growth with the workers in the form of higher wages, in return for which the labor unions agreed to let the managers run the companies and make investment decisions, etc. That was the sort of political economy foundation of the post-war American social democracy, and very similar in Europe too. So the question is there some version of that? Obviously, this is not mass production. It's a paradoxical idea, sort of capitalism without labor, especially if robots get involved. Does the term capitalism without labor make any sense? I mean, is a basic question. But assuming it does to some extent, what sort of social bargain can be struck to both make the system acceptable to people, but also to make it work on its own terms? Because, as you said, who's going to be buying all the goods and services that these robots and AI systems produce? That's the fundamental question.
Yeah.
They can't.
Who knows? Maybe the next versions that they package will be consumers as well, right? So that handles that problem.
That really would be. But as far as we can see, somebody's going to need to fill all the Delta seats down to the Caribbean in the winter. So they're going to have to. You know what I mean?
Let me shift to the other great focus of your work the last couple of years, Trumpian economics. I had asked a question about the 20th century and post-war, but let's narrow the temporal window here to the decade that just passed. So the MAGA movement has by and large treated the prior conservative, like fusionism, with great hostility. It's dispensed with appeals to the importance of market liberalism. It's leaned into economic populism. It's embraced tariffs. From 2012 to 2016, the Republican Party went from Mitt Romney to Donald Trump, two figures offering very different approaches to economic matters. What accounts for the steep divergence in just a few years from one approach to markets and trade and all the rest of it to a totally different one?
Well, I think Trump was a great opportunist. I mean, whatever else you think of him, you've got to give him credit for realizing the sort of political opportunity. I mean, I think he realized that the system we talked about, the sort of hyper-globalization, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, although it produced great wealth and great innovation, had failed in one of the sort of basic tasks of the system to raise the sort of living standards of ordinary working people. If you just go back and look at the sort of, weekly inflation-adjusted weekly wages over the decades, it basically goes up pretty steadily until about 1973, and then it just gets stuck for 40 years. Now there are various arguments about what indices you use. Some people say if you use different price index, it goes up further. But whichever price index you go, it doesn't go up anything like it did before that period. So that, I think, is was the fundamental issue. There was just a lot of economic discontent. And then then China entered the US, entered the global economy, and then entered the World Trade Organization. In the first decade of the century, we had the huge China shock, in which hit a lot of American industry, basic industry, things like textiles disappeared basically. A lot of sort of manufacturing industries. That hurt a lot of working class towns and cities, which were already struggling. And there was just a lot of political alienation from the system. Trump came along, and I think, as I say, to give him his credit, he realized there was a political opportunity there. And I've seen interviews where he said he was thinking of running from the left, but he couldn't do it because Bernie Sanders was already occupying that space. So he ran from the right and basically affected this sort of hostile takeover of the Republican Party, and it was just very successful. For whatever, the Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan party, was a successful political organization, but he just didn't have the foot soldiers that Trump did. Mitt Romney or Ryan could go to Ohio and hold a political rally, and they could turn up, a couple of thousand people, maybe sort of Tea Party activists or whatever. Trump could turn up and, 25,000, 50,000 people. I remember going out in 2016 to Long Island, Bethpage, which is not a poor area at all. And he was having a rally there, and I think he held 12,000, and there were thousands of people outside. And at that point, I realized, this is a mass movement which you've got to take seriously. And, I got in trouble. Lots of people resisted the idea when I said he was going to win the Republican primary and that he could win the election. But it turned out to be true. I had any great insights. I just was seeing what was happening on the ground. So I think that's what happened. Trump, there was this crisis of legitimacy in the system, and Trump put himself forward as the sort of the leader of it. Democrats, had their own sort of critic of the system, Bernie Sanders, but he didn't win. The establishment won the election, and it was very difficult for somebody like Hillary Clinton, who'd been integrally involved in the political establishment for 30 years, to promote herself as an outsider. And it was an outsider's election, and it's been an outsider's election ever since. So Trump's greatest strength is that people still 10 years later, a lot of Americans don't see him as a regular politician. So even though he's been in charge of the system for so long, for 5 years as president, 4 last time and 1 this time, he's still got his ratings are terrible, but to the extent he still has a political movement, it's built on the idea of him as the outsider.
Yeah. And that's an interesting dynamic to keep an eye out for the future, to see if it's going to be a seesaw from this point on, at a kind of permanent state between establishment and counter-establishment moves, one cycle to the other. So you couldn't have got more of an outsider than Trump, from that lineup of people when he won it. And then Biden, you couldn't have had someone who had been more entrenched in Washingtonian politics, someone whose career was longer than other people's actual, years alive, right? He had more time in the Senate than some of his rivals had, years on this earth. So will that be the dynamic moving forward?
I think it will to some extent. I mean, I think, the excesses of the second Trump era, we already see that in the opinion polls, is very unpopular. So I think there'd always the sort of turn against the incumbent. But I think what will determine the future is which party or which candidate does produce a sort of political platform that actually tackles some of these issues. Trump's problem is he's got great rhetoric, etc. But when he comes into office, he can't actually do anything about about things like affordability and house prices and etc. Because he's basically financially and politically still in hock to the large businesses. He's a populist in rhetoric, but he's not a populist in action. I mean, the Democratic Party faces the same problem. They're sort of adopting populist rhetoric, but they're basically financed still by by large businesses. The post-Citizens United world, that's just the reality of American politics, that is sort of unlimited money. So I think that's the great tension. How do you produce a sort of genuinely populist movement in a political system which is basically, corrupted by design?
That's interesting. You seem to see populism as a kind of fixture moving forward. Someone, if not outright populism, then some kind of more of an appeal to the masses than they'd had in the past when they approached their political, performance.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think that's just the left has. I mean, a good left-wing populist would, I think could capture some of that too. The basic dynamic in throughout sort of Europe and the US is a reaction against the sort of status quo at the moment, and you've got to channel that somewhere to have any political future, I think.
I think the most notable, the most noteworthy figure who has championed a kind of left-wing populism has been Bernie Sanders, as you mentioned. And we've also talked about the 2008 financial crisis. And I want to ask you a question about that. This is, of course, going to be a little bit hypothetical and counterfactual, but it's very easy to see how the financial crisis led to Bernie. It's very easy to see the Occupy Wall Street leading into a very through line to someone like Bernie. Do you think we would have gotten Trump had we not had that financial crisis as we had it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that short answer is no. I think the financial crisis sort of undermined the existing political establishment in both parties. And I think the problem with the Democrats and Obama, it's a terrible sort of political problem you have when the financial system basically collapses or is on the verge of collapse, because you have two options. You can let it collapse, in which case, the sort of spectre of the 1930s and the Great Depression is there, because that's exactly what we did in the 1930s. We just let the banks collapse for 3 years. And it wasn't until Roosevelt came in and declared a bank holiday and introduced deposit insurance that it stabilized the financial system. So I think in sort of the bailout was, it's politically horrible, but it was sort of necessary in economic terms. But it tarred the, even though it was introduced by Bush, by George W. Bush, Obama then implemented it in a lot of ways and sort of got tarred with it. And then the Republicans, very cynically, the Tea Party, even though it was their party which introduced the bailout, then pinned it on Obama very cleverly. And Obama, it was a very difficult political challenge for him, but he didn't manage to sort of free himself from that association. And I think then going forward after that, we had sort of a very sort of slow economic recovery, if you remember. It wasn't sort of 2% growth, less than 2% growth for years on end, which didn't lead to a big rebound in wages or living standards. So there was still a lot of sort of economic resentment and insecurity in 2016 for Trump and Bernie to run upon.
Well, can I ask you about that? Because the other piece of this is the messaging apparatus that the right has had and has activated and built up. Because is it true, John, that our recovery was in many ways outpacing recoveries in other parts of the world?
Oh, no, that's true. Yeah, I mean, relative to the past in the US, it wasn't, relative to past recoveries, it wasn't particularly strong, but relative to the rest of the world, it did. The US has had a very strong economy for 15 years. You just look at Europe GDP versus US GDP, and until about 2006, 2007, they were basically converging. And since then, the US performance has basically greatly outperformed Europe. So yeah, no, it's definitely the messaging apparatus. I think, the whole sort of populist online movement, the Republicans were quicker to sort of weaponize all that stuff. And I think the Democrats are sort of, getting it together now, but it's taken them a long time to catch up.
I have a theory as to why that is. It's because since they weren't a part of the mainstream discourse, and they were always kind of insurgent figures. Rush Limbaugh was an insurgent figure. That was the model that then the rest of the right-wing influencer space became. So they had many years of a head start of how to operate in that space, kind of be a bomb thrower.
Walk radio on the right provided a sort of, as you say, a template for the sort of online influencers.
And we liberals and broader people left of center, and we never had that kind of.
It was
we
difficult.
didn't build that.
There were, think of, Radio America. There were attempts at it, but it just it never really took off.
They spoke the language way before we
did. As you say, we're reading a sort of establishments journals like the New York Times or the New Yorker, etc. So they felt like they were already reasonably well served, whereas the people on the right thought that that they weren't well served, and that Rush Limbaugh was telling them the truth, and all the sort of liberal media wasn't. And again, Trump himself is a figure of the internet. I've followed Trump since the late 80s when I used to be a Wall Street correspondent, and he had his first sort of rise and fall. He's always been the same, Trump. He's basically a real estate developer and, a promoter, a self-promoter. It seems it's just inconceivable to me that he would have ever had any political career whatsoever without the internet. Because the established sort of media organs and sort of organs of communication thought he was a joke. And that was to his great advantage in 2016. He's basically a creature of the internet, and his Twitter account was the key to his rise.
Yeah, I remember doing this little feature for the Bark Digital, and I had collected his worst tweets ever into a kind of contest, like choosing the worst tweet ever. There was so much to choose from, so many terrible tweets, but that got so much engagement from people.
Well, I mean, I don't think he was the right man in the right place. I mean, I remember, in the 1980s or late 90s when, he was obsessed about getting in page 6 in the New York Post. He's always been obsessed about getting his name in the papers, etc. But then here came this magical technology. He was basically born for the attention economy, Trump.
Great way to put it.
Most journalists they had to learn that, the most extreme thing you say is going to be rewarded. Because in prior journalism, if you say something crazy, you lose your job. But on the internet, you get rewarded for it. Extremes. The only thing that attracts any attention is extremes. Trump didn't develop it; he didn't know why, but he was born for that environment.
That's a great point. The guy he sometimes sort of analogized to, Andrew Jackson, he had to be a kind of war figure in order to get that kind of cred, to be able to catapult himself to the office. Trump needed to be able to do the birther sequence where he would on Twitter just fire off a bunch of stuff about Obama and his illegitimacy, and that's what catapulted him rather than some kind of. So he's a creature of this age, yeah.
Yeah, post-truth, he really, he realized he didn't have to be. There was nobody fact-checking him. Well, there were people fact-checking him online, but it didn't make any difference. It made him more popular. So, again, I think it's instinctual. I don't think he had a great sort of brainwave that this was how it'd work out. He was born for that.
Right. Do you have time for a couple more? Just
Sure.
Okay. So Thomas Carlyle appears in your book as a critic of capitalism from the right, who rejected both market liberalism, and he also he rejected democracy in a sense. Do you see Carlyle's dark sort of proto-authoritarian conservatism in today's version of it as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I put Carlyle in there for a couple of reasons. Number one, I didn't want all the critics to be sort of lefties. I wanted some righties in there too. But number two, I think Carlyle is a sort of antediluvian figure. He was a great fan of sort of medieval monarchies and Frederick the Great, great fan of the German royal family. And he totally rejected modern democracy. But also, he was a critic of capitalism. That's what I think most people. He's sort of seen as a proto-fascist figure, basically. And he was also an inveterate racist and a pro-slavery, or at least critic of people who were critical of slavery. But in terms of his sort of economic views, he was actually quite left-wing. And he wrote books and essays about the impact that industrialization was having on the working classes. Wages did eventually rise, but in the early 19th century Britain, they didn't. So there was a lot of sort of immiseration. And he wrote about that. And he also wrote about the impact on morals. He had a great moral critique of capitalism. He called sort of the profit motive the shabbiest gospel ever invented. So that sort of right-wing critique of capitalism, I think, is you still do see elements of that, and you see it in various ways. You're starting to see it now in certain right-wing politicians criticizing big tech monopolies for profiteering, etc., and their attack on the social media companies for delivering pornography, etc. That sort of capitalism has no morality. That was exactly the critique that Carlyle was making in the 1830s and 1840s. So I think he's a sort of very old-fashioned figure in some ways, but again, it's one of those sort of ironies how the sort of old critiques come around again, and you could certainly write a piece about today using some of Carlyle's language, no problem.
You write that in the 2020s thus far, and certainly in the first few years of the 2020s, global capitalism has been, quote, facing a crisis of legitimacy of a sort it hadn't experienced since the 1930s, one that extended to the right as well as the left. Can you expound just briefly on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, that goes back to 2016 when I was thinking about the book, and we had Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump as major presidential candidates with critiques of the system, and both mobilizing huge crowds, etc. That really is something new in American history in my lifetime. And I think the only parallel is the 1930s when there was, the Great Depression, etc., and gave rise to critiques from the right and the left. There was a crisis of legitimacy, which Roosevelt, historically, he was the great savior of American capitalism. He came along and built the sort of Keynesian capitalism, Keynesian social democracy, which preserved the essentials of the system, the profit motive, most of industry in private hands, but built around it this government framework in terms of Keynesian economics, a welfare state, social security, etc., and basically saved the system and rescued it from its crisis of legitimacy. So it seemed to me that in 2016, and here we are 10 years later, in 2026, even more true, the system is facing a crisis of legitimacy. That's why I call this period a sort of interregnum period in which it's just not clear what is the next sort of model out there. Trump has got his model. Maybe that's going to succeed, but I don't think it will because it doesn't actually tackle the sort of fundamental contradictions of the system.
So the book emphasizes that fascism wasn't historically a grassroots phenomenon. It gained power through elite support. What does this tell us about the current moment when billionaires and tech bropreneurs, as I might call them, are increasingly aligned with authoritarian nationalist politics?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. I mean, unfortunately, the fascist movements in the interwar period did have mass support. They didn't have popular support, but if you look at the German example, I think the National Socialists got 28% of the vote in the last election before the elites brought Hitler into power, thinking that they could control him. But you're right, he was brought into power effectively by the elites. In Italy, Mussolini basically forced his way to power through force, and the squadrini, etc. But again, made a sort of compact with big business, set up industrial monopolies, etc. So there was a coalition there too. I mean, in terms of today, there are obviously some parallels in the sense that Trump and right-wing economic nationalism does have popular support. Trump's ratings, even now, his ratings still in the high 30s, maybe 40%, 35 to 40%. He's got that bedrock base of support who seem to support him, whatever. I saw a poll the other day and that still said of the people who voted for him in 2024, more than 90% still approve of his performance. So he's got that bedrock base. Fortunately, I mean, it's not a majority, and I don't think it ever will be a majority. But the sort of contradiction of Trump is that he's got this sort of populist working class base, but in economic terms, he's also aligned with the industrial oligarchs, especially the tech oligarchs, etc., who are completely against domestic sort of socialist programs, expanding the welfare state, raising social security, etc. Their whole goal is to shrink government. We saw that with Elon Musk and Doge, etc. So you've got this contradiction in that Trump has got these great populist rhetoric, but I don't, the structure of his alliance is that he can't deliver it in any way. So that's why I think it's ultimately not going to be a successful political movement. But it's an incredibly powerful protest movement. So, when you get next Democratic incumbent or whatever, there'll always be the sort of base of sort of Trump supporters there that people can motivate. I don't think the Trump movement is going away. Somebody else will inherit, whether it'll be as strong as him, who knows. But as I said, I don't think Trumpian economics is get back to one of your previous questions when you had talked about sort of historical blocks of support. That's a phrase from Gramsci, the Italian Marxist. I don't think the Trump movement is a stable historical bloc. I think it's an unstable bloc with this sort of inner contradictions. So that's why I think ultimately it will fail, unless, of course, it just goes full authoritarian, and then obviously it could succeed if it got rid of democracy and got rid of elections. Obviously, it would be full-blown fascism. But in terms of succeeding as a democratic movement, I'm sort of optimistic that it won't win out in the long term.
I'll stick up for my kind of classical liberal tribe here and qualify the way that Trump is approaching the shrinking of government. It's not something that any true defender of liberty or classical liberalism should want or defend, because the shrinking of government wherever there's waste or wherever there's an inefficiency, but it's the repurposing and reconceptualizing it as a tool of punitive political action against the people he perceives as his foes. He's doing
it basically.
He's weaponizing it. That's right.
It's a tool. I understand that.
And I'll take it further.
I understand the critique from. To be fair, I think some of the classical liberals are standing up to him and join the sort of Never Trump movement, etc. I respect them for that. I wasn't trying to say that Trump is a sort of classical liberal in that sense. I just mean that he's got these techno-libertarians, whatever you want to call them, behind him, who have a very sort of dark view of the future.
One thing that I think is a good distinction to make, for people, just what kind of figure is Trump? Is he just following a standard sort of libertarian approach? And I think and this is doing a little bit of psychoanalysis here, but I think the thing that bothers Musk and some of these other tech guys, Sachs and Trump, the thing that bothers them the most is not even so much that government is a certain level of bigness and they want to cut it down to size. They have this ideal about the minimal state. It's nothing like that. It's, liberals like these initiatives like USAID. Let's gut them for that reason alone. It's, you like this, so I hate this now.
Owning the libs, I agree. And
owning the libs.
Tribalism isn't compatible with classical liberalism, of course. It's based on sort of reason and the Enlightenment, etc. So I agree with you there. But again, I think you're just highlighting the fact that, it's a sort of internally inconsistent movement. And you also, you see that in the sort of grab bag of interventionist steps that he's taking in terms of sort of, demanding stakes in companies, etc., and issuing edicts to sort of big pharma, etc. You could see some of those things being done by a sort of heir to Bernie Sanders from the left, and you think, well, that's sort of consistent with their worldview, whether you agree with it or whether you don't. They're basically trying to restrain corporate power in some way. But from Trump, it just seems like it comes across as just inconsistent and, as you said, linked to some sort of personal vendetta rather than any sort of consistent political philosophy.
John, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Zooming In, a project of the UnPopulist. To get all of the updates from our new series, Executive Watch, make sure to subscribe for free at theunpopulist.net. Until next time.